Good morning. Truly, we've had a magnificent time since some of us have been here since Wednesday. And I just want you to know that this convening is of the magnitude of Seneca Falls when the women met to start the first feminist movement in this country. This gathering has had the magnitude of Niagara when the NAACP was formed. So I invite you to continue to hold Sankofa in prayer. And when you get the phone call, the text, or the email inviting you to be a part, know that it's come literally from God. This is a special place. This is an anointed place. Sister Addie works us very hard. Let me just make that plain. What's amazing is that we get more work done in a day and a half than I've seen some faculty get done in a semester. And so those of you who are privileged to study as Sankofa scholars do not take that for granted. And so again, we welcome you. We're grateful for you being here. And I have the awesome pleasure of introducing a dear friend. You can Google him and read all of the accolades and all the pedigree. I want you to know that he is truly a gentleman scholar. He is a phenomenal person. He is a professor emeritus of Christian social ethics from Princeton Theological Seminary and has been a visiting professor. Walter G. Murder, professor of social ethics at Boston University. I thought I'd give you just a few of the props. He's an avid sailor. Some of us can barely swim. But he's a sailor. He knows. He's not one of those folks who tell you they sail and they do it on occasion. No, he knows where the boom and the mast and all that stuff is. He knows the construction of the boat. He knows how that works. He's widely published. He's a global scholar. He's a recipient, as I said, of numerous awards. He's the spouse of C. Adrian Daniels Paris. And you have not seen love until you hang out with the two of them. And I had that privilege. The Society of the Study of Black Religion did its Black Study tour in Paris. And Sister Girl is a quilter par excellence. And when my brother, friend, Dr. Reverend, talks about his Adrian, he just lights up. He knows how to connect Jesus to social justice. So speaking acrostically, you know, that's one of the things I do as a poet. His name, P, prophetic pastoral professor. E, exquisite erudite excellence. T, transformative talented teacher. E, epic electric elegance. R, religious, relevant, revolutionary. Middle initial J, justice-seeking, joyful jewel. P, prodigious, and if you don't know what that means, add it to your vocabulary and look it up. Prodigious, personable philosopher. That's why Sister Addie has me a part of Sankofa, because that's the way I roll. Anyway, A, accomplished, appreciative Africana academician. R, regal, righteous restorer. I, inspiring intellectual interrogator. And S, saved, sanctified, soulful spirit. And as they say in the church tradition, and the next voice you shall hear and receive is none other than the Reverend Dr. Peter J. Paris. Hear ye him.
Oh, wow. Thank you very much, Sister Cheryl, for taking away every trace of humility that I might ever aspire to. Sister Addie Walker and colleagues and friends, thank you for the honor you have bestowed upon me to focus our attention this morning on the current state of Black church studies, Africana studies, and the vision of hope for this field. In my judgment, any assessment of the present state of the field must involve an overview of the relevant past and a diagnosis of the current issues and concerns. Only then can we set forth some prescribed remedies for securing the future. And thus the purpose of this lecture is to demonstrate how the mid-20th century civil rights movement, organized and led by Black church leaders, inspired the subsequent rise of Black church studies, African American studies, and African studies in order to continue their collective resistance to the racist doctrines of white supremacy and Black inferiority by their constructive responses to all such dogma and its practical consequences of chattel slavery, colonialism, segregation, discrimination, violence, poverty, sexism, and terror. The multidisciplinary nature of African American studies. It is important to note that I am using the term field of study rather than discipline, because Black church studies has been and continues to be a multidisciplinary undertaking. From the beginning, it has been studied by specialists in such disciplines as history, sociology, anthropology, political science, psychology, literature, and philosophy. In fact, Afro and African American studies programs from the 1970s onwards have comprised relevant courses selected from those various disciplines in colleges and universities. With some exceptions, however, the vast majority of postgraduate courses on the Black churches have been located almost completely in disciplines in theological seminaries and divinity schools, including the classical fields of theology, history, and biblical literature, as well as the practical fields of homiletics, pastoral care, Christian education, worship, and church administration. Suffice it to say that most African American clergy and theological scholars have been trained in either seminaries or divinity schools, while African American religious scholars have received their Ph.D. degrees from university graduate schools of religion. In recent decades, however, increasing numbers of these scholars have been teaching both undergraduate and graduate courses in various disciplines of religion, where they focus only on the academic study of religion as a cultural phenomenon. B, the invisible institution. Around the middle of the 18th century, enslaved Africans converted to Christianity only after they discovered that the Jewish and Christian Bibles portrayed their God as one who had taken the initiative in delivering the people of Israel from slavery and who continues to support the freedom of all peoples. Gradually, those nascent converts organized clandestine churches on the southern plantations, wherein their most gifted leaders preached about God's salvific works. Most important, their collective genius created countless so-called Negro spirituals, many of which are loved by most Christians in America and around the world. Among the most beloved of those songs are the following: the first signaling their hope for freedom, and the second, the necessity of concealing their worship. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. And steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here. Ironically, the spirituals are widely celebrated today as an original national treasure. Now, the impact of the civil rights movement. Similar to this clandestine phenomenon that 20th century scholars have called the invisible institution, African American scholarship in general and Black church studies in particular were invisible to most white Americans prior to the 1960s, even though such white male scholars as people like Herbert Aptheter, Eric Fauner, Eugene Genovese, Winthrop Jordan, Leon Litwack, August Meyer, Elliot Rudwit, Kenneth Stamp, and others had established themselves as specialists in the field of so-called Negro studies. Inspired by the 1954 Supreme Court decision, the 20th century civil rights movement burst on the scene, the national scene, in December 1955, when Mrs. Rosa Parks refused to yield her seat to a white man on a bus in Montgomery. Her arrest was followed by a year-long bus boycott led by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who had recently assumed the pastorate of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. At a time when television was still in its infancy, news of the so-called Negro protests against white segregation on public transportation in the heart of the old Confederacy gained national attention as pictures of the public demonstrations appeared on the news channels. For the first time, white America saw images of mass meetings in Black churches that revealed a treasure house of eloquent, persuasive Black preachers, as well as men, women, and children singing the old spirituals that were often ingeniously updated with the names of contemporary persons and cities of the present struggle. It is important to note that the Montgomery bus boycott marked the first time that African Americans in the South had demanded justice by publicly confronting the white power structure of their respective cities. Dr. King quickly saw the connection between the Montgomery protests and the worldwide endeavors of oppressed peoples for freedom, especially those in Africa. The novelty of the event sparked the interest of various national news media, which followed the movement's development on a daily basis. And thus, unwittingly, they documented the movement's movement in both film and movement's development in both film and print. Let me hasten to say, however, that apart from the Black newspapers and radio stations, whose audiences was entirely Black, the national news media and its reporters were almost wholly white males who interpreted the events of the day through their perspectives, which most Blacks had good reason to suspect. The invisibility of Black scholarship. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, African American scholarship was largely hidden from the gaze of whites because it, like the Black churches, was confined to the enclaves of racially segregated Black academic environs. Though Black scholars had received their Ph.D. degrees from a limited number of predominantly white universities, such as Harvard, Yale, Boston, Drew, and the University of Chicago, only the last two had appointed an African American to its faculty by the early 1960s. Most Black scholars of that era focused their attention on the responses of their people to racial oppression in order to repudiate the racist myth of white supremacy and its teaching about the genetic inferiority of Blacks and their natural disposition towards laziness and dependency. Accordingly, those pioneer Black scholars produced a veritable canon of publications, associations, journals, and advocacy programs that eventually constituted the foundation for the emergent African American studies programs demanded by Black students following the 1968 assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Consequently, African American scholars will always be grateful for the ancestral legacy of such academic pioneers, some of which are the following. Carter G. Woodson, founder of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History in 1915, the Journal of Negro History in 1926, the Negro History Bulletin for Children and Teachers in 1937, the Negro History Week in 1926, that was changed to Black History Month in 1970. Further, he published the first comprehensive history of the Negro Church in 1921 and founded the Associated Publishers, Incorporated, in that same year. Further still, in addition to over 20 books and hundreds of articles, he has been rightly called an institution builder for Black history in general and Black church studies in particular. Woodson's contemporary, the iconic W.E.B. Du Bois, also a Harvard Ph.D. graduate, demonstrated similar breadth and excellence in both his scholarship and public leadership. He was one of the principal founders of both the Niagara Movement in 1906 and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909, wherein he served as editor of his official publication, the Crisis magazine, for over 3 decades. He also was a primary organizer of a series of Pan-African conferences between 1920 and 1945 in London, Brussels, Lisbon, Manchester, and New York that brought together several African and Caribbean students destined to become the fathers of the various independent movements in Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Sierra Leone, Tanzania, Jamaica, and Trinidad. Both Woodson and Du Bois demonstrated their rigorous commitment to academic research and public advocacy for racial justice, never separating the one from the other. Other notable African American scholars during the first half of the 20th century included Miles Mark Fisher, John Hope Franklin, E. Franklin Frazier, Zora Neale Hurston, Clifton S. Johnson, James Weldon Johnson, Elaine Locke, Brayford Logan, Benjamin E. Mays, Dorothy Porter Wesley, Howard Thurman, Henry McNeil Turner, Charles H. Wesley, and one could go on and on. All of these and several more were significant forerunners to the nascent African American studies programs that Black students in predominantly white universities and colleges demanded in the wake of Dr. King's assassination, clearly among the greatest catastrophes ever reflected on African Americans. The emergence of African American studies. It is an understatement to say that virtually every African American was enraged by the shock of Dr. King's tragic death. Everyone felt the necessity to express their anger, and many sought positive ways to do so. Distrustful of white liberals with whom they were associated, Black clergy in many predominantly white denominations, and students in various predominantly white colleges and universities soon began forming Black caucuses in order to develop constructive strategies for effecting the necessary changes in their respective environments. That activity greatly shocked their white allies, who did not consider themselves racist, because after all, they had allied themselves with the struggle for racial justice for many decades. But they had no awareness of the privileges they enjoyed by virtue of having been born with a white skin. And thus they felt wrongly treated by Blacks who refused to allow them to attend their caucus meetings. Some of those original pioneers are here in the audience today. J. Alfred Smith, been one, and Yvonne Delk, been another. Though the struggles for racial justice on university campuses in the late 1960s occurred in a sea of many diverse protests, Black students were also struggling with the opposing philosophies of racial segregation, racial separation, and racial integration. That is, the nationalist philosophy of Malcolm X and the integration philosophy of Martin Luther King Jr. Their demands for Black Students Associations, separate meeting places, and Black Studies programs seem to combine dimensions of both perspectives that would be explored critically in the nascent African American Studies programs that resulted from their demands. Though the many Black student associations have been sustained over the years as an important support system for Black students in predominantly white institutions, African American Studies programs have had a checkered history because most of them were not firmly cemented into the structures of academia. Eventually, Blacks would see the difference between university programs and university departments. The former constitute no major commitment from the universities, while the latter have tenured and tenure-track professors presiding over degree programs, and hence are very difficult to dismantle. And thus, less than 1/3 of the 600 that once existed have survived. Approximately 70 such programs became departments that offer undergraduate degrees, and approximately 20 of those offer Ph.D. degrees in the field. But all of those offering Ph.D. programs are in predominantly white institutions. Black church studies programs have been confined almost entirely to seminaries, where their courses have been drawn from faculty members located in various departments. Schools like Candler School of Theology, Duke University Divinity School, Princeton Theological Seminary, Vanderbilt University Divinity School, and many others now offer certificates in Black church studies to expand the students' knowledge about the history and contemporary importance of the Black churches in America and around the world. Some threatening trends. Alas, the gradual decline of many Protestant churches in the nation has led to a similar decline of students in seminaries and divinity schools. It is now doubtful that many of the small seminaries with small endowments will be able to survive much longer. The recent closings of the Episcopal Divinity School and Andover Newton Theological Seminary have drawn heightened attention to many others. Princeton Theological Seminary is the only independent seminary that offers the Ph.D. degree in theology and related fields. All the others are divinity or schools of theology in universities and heavily dependent on the number of MDiv students taking the primary degree. And thus we have a vicious circle. A steady decline in MDiv students invariably leads to a similar decline in the faculty, as well as the number of admissions to their Ph.D. programs, and thus fewer African American admissions to those Ph.D. programs, and eventually a decline in the number of African American teachers in both historic Black seminaries and predominantly white seminaries, the latter of which contain the various Black church studies programs. Revolutionary changes in the academy. The 1960s constituted a period of revolutionary cultural changes, not only in the United States, but around the world. Authoritarian structures and traditions were being replaced everywhere. Independence movements from colonial rule were rampant throughout the African continent and a great inspiration for African Americans. In March 1957, Dr. King and his wife Coretta Scott King attended Ghana's independence celebration as the guest of Africa's first independent Prime Minister, Kwame Nkrumah. And on the eve of the Great March on Washington, August 28, 1963, W.E.B. Du Bois died in Ghana, where in 1958 he had been invited by Nkrumah to spend the rest of his life. Rejected by his own country, Ghana honored him with a state funeral, and his home there was turned into a memorial site that now houses his library and his tomb and that of his wife. During the late 1960s, the anti-Vietnam War protests in America had spread to Western Europe, and thousands took refuge in my native Canada. University students began demanding the right to participate in all governance decisions affecting their lives. Women began demanding access to all the spheres of public and professional life, hitherto reserved for men alone. They had begun shunning the traditions of female confinement to the privacy of the home to care for their husbands and children without pay. Betty Friedan's 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, and Mary Daly's book, Beyond God the Father, and Bell Hook's book, Feminist Theory from Margin to Center, and Alice Walker's books, The Color Purple and In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, are representative of waves of white feminists and black feminist thought that would soon constitute new fields of study, which evoked much opposition. Clearly, the civil rights movement had inspired all of those oppressed peoples and many others to demand freedom from the various shackles that had once silenced them. They included white women, black men, and black women, Native Americans, migrant farm workers, gay men and lesbian women, the poor, and many others. Each of those constituencies sought to change the universities by forcing them to respond to their respective concerns and demands. Another major impact of the civil rights movement resulted from the radicalization of its youth. In 1966, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, had issued a radical critique of the movement's philosophy of integration and nonviolence that was promulgated by its president, Stokely Carmichael's call for Black Power during a Emeritus march in Greensville, Mississippi. That action marked a split in the civil rights movement between radicals and moderates, the former led by Carmichael and the latter by Dr. King. Many so-called white liberals were shocked on July 31st, 1966, when 48 black clergymen, calling themselves the National Committee of Negro Churchmen, later called the National Committee of Black Churchmen, and in the early 1980s, the National Committee of Black Christians, sponsored a full-page ad in the New York Times to register their support for Black Power. Approximately 60% of those clergymen were members of predominantly white Protestant denominations, and 40% were members of black denominations. Comprising the vanguard of a new theological orientation with no theological scholars in the seminaries, Gayrod S. Wilmore, an ordained Presbyterian minister serving as that church's executive director of the Commission on Race from 1962 to 1973, introduced the NCNC, the National Committee of Negro Churchmen, to a young black theologian, James H. Cone, who was teaching at Adrian College in Adrian, Michigan. They invited Cone to help them draw up a theological statement in support of Black Power, which he did. Motivated by a mixture of anger and grief over Dr. King's assassination, Cone spent several weeks tirelessly plunged in the process of writing the most important book that launched a significant era for African Americans in theological education. The radical nature of his work lay in his decision to make Black Power the most radical political symbol of the day, the basis for his theological project. That book was published in 1969 under the title Black Theology and Black Power, was a passionate, erudite, angry, independent, compelling response to racial injustice and a blatant condemnation of the hypocrisy of European and American theological traditions. And thus he wrote, since there was nothing in European theology that spoke directly to slavery, colonialism, and poverty, why should I let white theologians tell me what the gospel is? Having written a dissertation on Karl Barth's anthropology, It seemed likely that his first book thereafter would reveal a strong Barthian influence, which did not go unnoticed by his black critics. Yet his endeavor to demonstrate the relationship of Christian theology to the African American experience of racial oppression was a novel accomplishment, destined to make an indelible mark on systematic theology per se and theological studies in general. Cone faced enormous opposition from the gatekeepers of the Theological Academy. In the absence of any academic role models for his novel endeavor, Cone's first conversational partners in the development of the Black Theology Project were the black clergy in the National Conference of Negro Churchmen. The prominent sociologist of religion, Professor C. Eric Lincoln, was one of his strongest supporters, who not only encouraged him in his work, but took the initiative in introducing him to his first publisher. In the following year, 1970, the Society for the Study of Black Religion was formed for the purpose of providing an independent space for black scholars to critique and encourage one another's academic work and assess the desired impact of black theology on the various disciplines in theological education, such as theology itself, systematic theology, history of Christian thought, biblical literature, Christian ethics, homiletics, Christian education, church administration, and pastoral care. That organization, now in its 48th year, continues to meet from Thursday to Saturday, a week before Palm Sunday, every year in selected locations, with membership open to all who possess Ph.D. degrees or have passed their qualifying exams. This past summer, that organization met on a tour in Paris, a study tour in Paris, to explore Black Paris, because so many African-American scholars and artists, singers and musicians and leaders and African had taken refuge in Paris from the 1900s through to the Second World War. Most important, Cone's thought prompted a vigorous debate among the few black religious scholars teaching in seminaries at that time. In 1971, Professor J. Diotis Roberts, I was on the faculty of Howard University at that time with J. Diotis Roberts, a systematic theologian teaching at was then called the Howard University School of Religion and later changed to Howard University School of Divinity, published a book entitled Liberation and Reconciliation, a Black Theology, that argued for a balance between the quest for liberation and the quest for reconciliation with whites. In my judgment, it was an important, soft critique which enabled those on Dr. King's side of the debate over black power to embrace the concept of black power while affirming it with no equivocation. About the concept of nonviolence. In 1972, as a corrective to the lack of historical reference to the black church in Cone's first book, Gayrod Wilmore published his book, Black Religion and Black Radicalism, an Interpretation, where he demonstrated the extent to which black history can be interpreted as black religion and its quest for freedom and justice. In that book, he embraced some dimensions of Professor Charles H. Long's most sustained criticism of Cone's theology by his claim that the concept theology is a European term that distorts black religion whenever it's applied to it. That's Long's argument. Rather, he argued that the ancient language of myth is the only adequate descriptor of religion. And thus, within the first 2 years of Cone's black theology, the complexity of the ensuing debate was demonstrated by the arguments offered by Charles Long, by J.D. Otis Roberts, and Gayrod S. Wilmore, arguments that continue in our day. Though beyond the scope of this lecture, suffice it to say that the relation between Black theology and African and Caribbean theologies on the continent and in the diaspora was significant, and the Ecumenical Association for Third World Theologies provided an organizational umbrella for ongoing discussion among those who were privileged to be invited into its membership. The theologies of womanists and Black women. In the mid-1980s, James Cone was shocked to hear several African American women, students, at Union Theological Seminary in New York raise their voices of criticism against Black theology's oversight of African American women's experience in religion. That concern was heightened by their discernment that the nascent white feminist movement also rendered Black women invisible. And thus they concluded that they needed to find their voices in the Theological Academy, since they had had a long history of exclusion, marginalization, and domination by Black male leaders in the Black churches and by white women in their respective organizations. Inspired by the definition of the term womanist provided by the novelist Alice Walker, they soon adopted the term as a fitting name for their own theological thought. And in doing so, they thought it necessary to separate themselves temporarily from both the white feminists and the Black theologians in order to cultivate the academic terrain and form their own distinctive contributions to theological discourse. Walker's definition of the term womanist contained all the ingredients of inclusiveness that they desired for their mission, namely rigorous analysis of gender, race, and class. Henceforth, womanist thought in any sphere of theology would be characterized by its inquiry into the functions of all three of those social indicators that have always disempowered Black women. And thus, womanist theology is holistic in its aim to be inclusive of all peoples in all circumstances of life, emphasizing both a pastoral voice of love and a compassion and a prophetic voice of criticism, aimed at the call for and the promotion of justice for all. But African American women outside theological education have chosen not to use the term womanist to define themselves, but rather they continue to use the term Black feminists. During the past 3 decades, the numbers of African American women entering all the degree programs in theological seminaries and divinity schools has multiplied exponentially, due in large part to the steady growth of Black women theologians preserving, advancing, and promoting their womanist agenda in all the fields of theological scholarship. Their work was encouraged by James Cone, who quickly viewed womanist theology as a necessary complement to his own Black theology. And the first generation of womanist scholars included Jacqueline Grant, Katie G. Cannon, Cheryl Townsend Jelks, and Dolores Williams. Prior to the birth of womanist scholarship and theology, Professor Mercy Amba Oduyoye was teaching at the University of Ibadan, Nigeria, where she declared that the male theologians in Africa spoke for only 1/2 of Africa's population. I was in Africa at that time when Mercy was beginning these statements. The other half comprised women who had always played important, though subordinate roles in religion, and whose thought should be shared with one another. And thus she and a small number of her women colleagues decided in 1989 to form the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians, the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians, who would meet and worked together in order to give public expression to their voices. And only a few of them at that time were professional theologians or scholars in training, but those numbers would grow rapidly in the ensuing decades. Most important, like the womanist theologians in America, they were not interested in confrontation, but in balancing the theological voices of men and women so as to effect greater wholeness and thus contribute to the reunion of God's divided humanity. And now finally, there's the conclusion. On the basis of this broad overview of our history, we conclude with the cliche that we have come a long way, but still have a very long way to go. During the past half-century, African American studies programs in predominantly white universities and colleges have nurtured the birth of a new academic paradigm, one in which black scholars rigorously criticize European thought and has long ignored, misunderstood, and distorted black thought. Yet they have secured themselves by evolving into relatively few departments that offer degrees in the subject matter. Some schools, like Princeton and Harvard University, have expended huge sums of money to secure a future for African studies, and to a lesser extent, African studies. Much more study is needed to assess the number of tenured and tenure-track African American faculty presently employed and the extent to which those numbers are holding steady, increasing, or declining. Such quantitative data are needed in both undergraduate and graduate programs. Similar data are needed with respect to black church studies, some of which may be attainable through the Association of Theological Schools, the accreditation agency of those schools. As indicated above, many of the denominational seminaries that are in decline are not likely venues for securing the future of black church studies. We assume that the four historic black seminaries, Howard University School of Divinity, Shaw University School, Divinity School, Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology of Virginia Union University, the Interdenominational Theological Center, will continue to nurture black church studies as part of their raison d'etre. But since all Ph.D. degrees in religion are offered by predominantly white universities and divinity schools, therein data needs to be collected about the number of African Americans in those programs in order to assess their prospects for the future. Finally, I contend there is a compelling need for a summit conference on the future of black church studies and Africana studies. It should be a strategy-making conference, and hence its participants must be carefully selected. Funding for such a conference might be provided by the Eli Lilly Foundation that has provided so much financial support for the Fund for Theological Education, now the Forum for Theological Exploration over the years, the name of which, well, as I said, has now changed to the Theological Forum, the Forum for Theological Education. In fact, the Lilly Foundation should be one of the organizers for the Summit Conference. All the appropriate data collection should be done prior to that conference. An important part of the agenda should be an assessment of the contribution that black church studies, African American studies, and Afrikaner studies have made to the enrichment of academic life in the universities, colleges, seminaries, and divinity schools. Thank you for your attention to this rather long lecture. I appreciate it very much.